Welcome to FitBody Lifestyle, the show where we dive deep into the world of fitness, health, business, relationships, and the art of living a balanced life. I'm Jami.
And I'm Greg, and we're here to give you the benefit of our experiences in the fitness and bodybuilding industry, the corporate world, running a business, personal development, and building healthy relationships.
Whether you're sweating it out in the gym, hustling in your business, or seeking balance in your everyday life, you're in the right place.
So lace up those sneakers and grab that water bottle, and let's get ready to transform our minds, our bodies, and our lives.
Welcome back to another episode of FitBody Lifestyle. I'm so excited to be here with my favorite person in the world here, Papa Bear, Gregory DeBernard.
Hi.
And we're just coming off of an incredible show weekend. The Pittsburgh Pro just happened this past weekend. We had 15 Olympians on the stage. So it really gave us a great opportunity to see where things are in terms of the bikini criteria. So today's episode is going to be analyzing the bikini criteria and talking a little bit about what we're seeing and how things are continuing to develop this season.
So I explained this. We did a seminar with Sandy Williamson, one of the Olympia judges and one of the head judges in the NPC a few weeks ago in San Antonio. And one of the things that we were talking about, so Sandy will always present on the bikini criteria, and I explain that a little bit differently and based on some background that I have as a lawyer. And so as a lawyer, and specifically I was a trial lawyer, so I'm in court and arguing things to judges and to juries. That was my stock and trade for years. And the way I explain the judging criteria for bikini, and this applies to bikini, wellness, men's physique, classic, all the divisions. There are criteria for each of the divisions, and I want you to think of the criteria, or at least I think of the criteria as the law. But the judges will always interpret that law or that criteria based on their own perspective, their own subjective experience, how they are viewing things. This is no different in the law as it is in contest judging. So a judge is going to take that criteria, but then they're going to look at an athlete and say, well, I think this person better illustrates the bikini criteria than the person next to them. So there is always going to be that subjective overlay of the judge's interpretation of the criteria based on their experience, their own biases. And let's face it, everybody is biased. I used to say that one of the jokes I had in arguing for a jury is that we always wanted to get an unbiased jury. But in truth, I wanted a jury that was most biased towards my client's perspective. And you would question them about that prior to selecting them as jurors. But everybody has biases. Everybody has preferences. And those biases and preferences are not a bad thing. They are just something to understand as you're interpreting the criteria against the results.
Well, I think one of the things that is unique about the bikini category specifically is there are different body types that do still fit the criteria.
Right.
So, I think of all the divisions, it has the most kind of bandwidth in terms of, different types of physiques and things like that fitting. And at the end of the day, there are specific criteria that need to be met. And so that's basically what we want to break down today. And then also talk a little bit about what we're hearing when we're talking to the judges. I definitely feel like, one of the things that's really important for an athlete is, to have a coach that is interested in learning and constantly asking questions, being present at shows, learning from the judges. I literally learn something every single time. So, I spent a lot of time talking to the judges backstage after the show was done with each one of the athletes. I also listened to some of the feedback that, was given to some of the other athletes because I'm looking for those common threads. I'm looking for, what different judges are seeing, what they're, how they're interpreting things. So, there's also an opportunity to go on to the Instagram for the IFBB, and Tyler Mannion, who is the vice president is
of the IFBB NPC.
Yeah,
right?
he goes on there and actually breaks things down from his perspective as well, which I think is hugely beneficial. So, hopefully we can provide just kind of a little bit of, of our perspective and our experience and things like that that'll help, people to understand a little bit better what's
that came in our feed today, or our email today, is that the email from the IFBB where they break down the Pittsburgh results from this past weekend. And they do that pretty much every weekend. And they also include some judges' tips. The judges' tip this week was about stage presence, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But I thought that was a really good point. And as you know, again, as we talk to this, and I think the point that you made was really helpful and spot on about the criteria can apply to different body types. Or the body types can apply differently to the criteria. And I do think that's so important because it's not, I think what we're talking about here is the importance of showing up when you can. I don't think anybody can be at every show. That there's multiple shows in a weekend, but show up to the shows as much as you can and look for those things. And when you have the opportunity to speak with the judges and get that clarity, that can be very helpful. I think a lot of people rely on pictures after the fact, or they'll watch the live stream. And among the various things I would say is the least beneficial is to look at someone's picture on Instagram and say, this person meets the criteria or they don't. I think that can be somewhat helpful, but not when it comes to a contest result. So if you're looking at somebody's picture ahead of the show or after the show and say, wow, they look like they should have won. Well, I think you're not looking at that. You have to see them in the lineup against the criteria. So that's the first level, I would say. The second level is then looking at the individual still photos of that show, which can be helpful, but still not the same as being there in person. Seeing the live feed or the live stream is the next level, and that is more helpful. But the most helpful is to be there in person to see how the judges are applying the criteria to the athletes in the show. I don't know if you agree with that progression.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And one of the interesting things that I see a lot is there are different people that do like to review the shows or make predictions. And I mean, those are always fun to watch and listen to and things like that. The thing, especially when they're doing a breakdown after a show, that I feel like is important to decide on whether or not you want to hold credence to what they're saying is, were they at the show?
Right.
So if somebody's doing a review and they weren't actually at the show, it's going to have less value than if they were actually there, because the pictures and the videos and the live stream, especially, the quality is just not there. You can't see the same level of detail, in especially still photos, because you're looking at a moment in time versus seeing the movement and, being able to tell, sometimes something's shaking or something, you need to really truly be there in person. And which is why, we're up there at shows sitting right behind the judges every single time, analyzing every little thing so that we're constantly learning and being able to hone our eye so that we can make sure that when we bring in our athletes, they're on point.
And I think the two things that we always talk about, you already kind of said this, but we leave each weekend with probably more questions than we do answers. And I don't mean questioning the judges' results or anything, but just questioning how we can then deliver our athletes based on what we're seeing. So we're really going to the show with a lot of curiosity in terms of, hey, how are these placings falling out in the lineup? And I thought about something that we had experienced last week, not relative to a show, but the difference between being in person versus being in video. And we were posing some clients that are getting ready for a show, and they send in a check-in video, and that check-in video shows you a certain level of quality. And then we would do an in-person posing it virtually by video, but we see something even different there in the live versus a videotape. So if you're just thinking about these things in terms of how they apply, the important piece is that there's no one way to do things. There are many different ways of doing things, but just recognize the trade-offs that you're getting, or maybe that you're not getting the complete perspective in certain views versus another. So, still photos versus video versus live stream, or video versus, somebody videotaping from the audience versus the live stream versus being there in person. These are all going to give you a little bit different perspective in terms of how you're looking at that criteria against those athletes. And as I said, we saw that last week, where when we got into a virtual posing session, we saw different things that we didn't see in the video that that the person had submitted. So I just keep these things in mind because it helps you give context and perspective to what you're looking at.
I completely agree. And this is also one of the reasons we suggest people get feedback in person if they can. Sometimes the judges are not always able to stay afterwards, or, the athlete may not be able to stay afterwards. But if they can, we really do encourage them because it's fresh in the judge's mind. They just saw you in person. Maybe if they have a question as to what, something on the notes that they wrote, they might actually look at you, have you hit a pose or two or something like that. So anyway, I think we kind of beat that one, but, but I mean, we've gotten to shows and seen people who we couldn't see a striation on their videos or their pictures and get there and they have striations. And then we're trying to like fill them out a little bit more and make some adjustments and things, which again is why we show up at the shows, because getting to see videos and pictures aren't always, the best. So whether it's us personally or another coach that's on site to give us that feedback, it's really important. But do you want to start going down the criteria and then we'll break it down?
And I'll just, for credit on this, I'm pulling these right off of Becky Clausen's Instagram. But these are the same ones that Tyler has posted because I think
they're on the NPC News.
Yeah, and they're on the NPC News. So these are all consistent, but I'm just pulling the one that I just happen to have handy. So the first thing is delts with a small amount of roundness is what they want. And do you want me to cover what they want and what they've said specifically they don't want as well?
Yeah, and then we could talk about, let's go through each one, but yes.
Okay, so delts with a small amount of roundness, a conditioned core, full rounded glutes with slight separation between hams and glutes, a curvy hourglass silhouette, overall presentation that exudes health and femininity. And those are the things that are wanted. The things that are not wanted is caps and certainly not striated shoulders, an etched thick six-pack, squared off glutes, extreme muscle density or vascularity, and deep separation, graininess, and hardness.
Okay, I thought we were going to go through each one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think it's good to give an overview, and then let's break them all down individually. So I think shoulders were the first thing that you talked about.
Delts with a small amount of roundness versus capped and certainly not striated shoulders.
I think that this is one of those that's sometimes hard for people to decipher, where's that line? One of the things I would definitely consider is the balance of the shoulders with the rest of the body. I know, kind of coming off the Pittsburgh, I'm just going to use that as an example. So if people want to see, Amy, our athlete, Amy Delgado, did end up winning the show. And one of our the feedback for Amy has been to downsize the shoulders just a tiny bit, just to make sure they're a little bit more imbalanced. But one of the things, thinking about her structure, she has a little bit broader structure up top. So in order to keep the criteria that they're looking for, just making sure that we're, not overpowering the body with the shoulder caps. So that's the first thing that's on the list. And
so Jami, let's talk about that for just a minute, a little bit deeper. Somebody with a wider shoulder girdle, shoulder width, may have to put less shoulders on than somebody with a more narrow shoulder span or shoulder girdle because they just don't have the width to give that hourglass.
You said it perfectly.
Okay.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. And they want to see shape. They want to see some shape to the delt. They want to see a little bit of separation. They just don't want them to be overpowering. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You want to go to the next one?
Yeah, let's go to the next one.
This one is my favorite one because the criteria states a conditioned core. What they don't want is an etched in thick six-pack. And the reason why I think this one is so interesting is how many times do we get in feedback from athletes that I don't have a six-pack. I mean, there's this focus on that. And I know, and we talked about this during your time in figure, is that's just something that's not even scored in figure is having a six-pack.
Right. So they want to see a little bit of lines in the abdominal area so you can see that there is, some muscle,
right,
and some conditioning. So I would say that on the large part, we're not doing a ton of core work when it comes to bikini. Like if you're a brand new competitor, then yes, you're going to need to get a little bit of density in that core. But what we don't want to do is kind of get a bit bigger, thicker sort of like, especially, bigger, thicker obliques, bigger, thicker abs where the waistline starts to expand a bit. That's not what we're looking for in bikini. So in bikini, really what we want is just some nice shape, some nice definition. We want to see that it's tight, that that there's the right level of conditioning. That's really what we're looking for from bikini. So for the most part, I'm typically having people do non-weighted types of abdominal work, more, some vacuuming, some, that's I like things like plank poses, things like that. I love yoga because you're working on tightening and strengthening the core, but without building, extra size or bulk, where you'll start to get kind of like that tortoise shell or those thicker looking abdominal muscles that they're not really wanting to see in bikini.
And we talk about this a lot. So if you're IG surfing, you'll see a lot of women or athletes wearing the waist trainers. Ronnie Coleman in the men's bodybuilder world used to talk about wearing a belt to keep his waist as thin as possible. And I just want to explain the purpose of that. The waist trainer, there's a balance. And I think this is the thing. And I think in bodybuilding, there's a tendency for if a little bit is good, then a lot is great. And the truth is that you can overdo something on one end and underdo something on the other end. So finding that sweet spot is really right. What we want for the waist trainers and the belts is really to help deactivate the core so that you're not over relying on it and over pushing on it to make it grow. We see this in CrossFit athletes in particular, a lot of powerlifting sports where there is a lot of core engagement, and having that strong core in order to perform those lifts becomes something that's really crucial. In bodybuilding, we want to keep that waist as tight as possible, not just from a conditioning perspective, but from a size perspective, because the size of that waist then translates into the other proportions for your glutes, for your back, for your upper body. It provides that midpoint. And you think of the hourglass, the hourglass comes down to that choke point in the middle. And so that's what the waist represents in the hourglass. Is we want to keep that waist tight and slim, but we also want to keep the core conditioned. So there's a balance between those things.
Right. And I want to just elaborate a little bit. When you say deactivate the core, it's really important that your core is activated when you're training. So every single exercise you do, you should initially be pulling your core in nice and tight, but that's different than the activation that we're talking about where we're going for building.
Right.
So we're talking more about that, keeping that waistline tight, which if you're wearing a belt or a waist trainer, then the idea is it helps to remind you to hold everything nice and tight, so we're wanting to train everything in. And they're not always appropriate, so you got to know whether or not it makes sense for you. Usually if I'm recommending it for somebody, if they've got like really big, thick obliques, maybe they did some sort of sport in the past where, they built a lot of density, then in that case, we're wanting to atrophy that down just a little bit to make that waistline look smaller. But we still want a strong, healthy core to support everything else that we're doing. So just for clarity, let's make sure. And thank
you for explaining that more completely. Okay, so the next one, let's talk about this, because I think this is probably going to be, and I'm very mindful of words matter, and that this relates to the first thing I talked about with the law and judges interpreting the law, and so much of that interpretation hinges on individual words that are used in the criteria. So full round glutes with slight, and the slight is in all caps, separation between hams and glutes is what is the criteria. What is not wanted is squared off glutes. So why don't you explain that? I do think there's a huge emphasis of glutes in bikini, and it is certainly an important piece, but it's not the only piece. It's the entire presentation.
Right. It is a really important thing for people to understand. You really want to have balance first and foremost. So when I say balance, upper body to lower body, and then let's talk about lower body. We're talking about glutes. The glutes should be balanced with the legs. So we don't want giant glutes and really thin legs. We don't want big legs and small glutes. We want a balance between quads, hamstrings, and then quads and hamstrings and glutes. There should be some balance there. Now, when we start talking about conditioning, that's where we start, getting into the separation between the muscles. So there's two pieces to this. There's the development, and then there's also how lean we get. So what they don't want to see, we should not see deep etched in lines with the hamstrings. So going down the legs, and I feel like people get confused as to what this means. So you have your adductors, which are the muscles, your inner thigh muscle, and then you have your hamstring right next to it. When you start getting a really deep line in there, that's not part of the bikini criteria, and not something they're looking for. What they would like to see is a little bit of separation, very slight bit of separation around the tie-in. So basically the way that the glute muscle inserts above the hamstring, you see just a tiny bit of separation. It forms like a little bit of a V around the bottom. Now, everybody's shaped a little bit different. If somebody's got a little bit higher insertion, then you're not going to see as much of the V. You're going to see like a smaller one. If you've got a lower insertion, you're going to see a little bit lower V. But at the end of the day, they don't want that deep, hard, or grainy looking. They want it to just be very soft, but you can basically see the muscle. You can see where the muscle inserts.
And while you were giving that explanation, I went to the NPC's webpage just to make sure that we're presenting this clearly. And there was no change really to the glutes, but I did want to kind of go back and maybe give a little, or should I do that at the end? You want me to do it now?
I don't know what you're going. I don't know what you're going to do.
Sorry. The criteria explained on the NPC website is just a little bit more detailed than what I had presented initially. So the criteria for judging female physiques, and this is for all female categories, and then they get specific on the bikini. Muscularity, the amount of muscle will vary between the divisions. Condition will vary depending on the division. Symmetry and balance, presentation. So those are general categories. And the reason I wanted to present those is because what you were describing was the symmetry aspect, and the relative proportion of one body part to another. In bikini, a foundation of muscle which gives shape to the female body, full round glutes with a slight separation between the hamstring and the glute area, which you just talked about. A small amount of roundness to the delts, which we had talked about. Conditioned core, overall look, hair, makeup, suit, and tan.
Right.
So I just wanted to make sure we were giving all those, but I think we can continue with the other list.
Well, I did want to bring on when we talk about striations or graininess. I think that's a really important thing to explain, because I think that there are people out there that are using these words in a confusing way.
Yeah.
For example, I've heard people say before, that Amy is grainy or, hard looking. And if you go and look at pictures or even more so look at her in person, you cannot see a striation on her body. You can't. So when we're talking about graininess, or if we're talking, graininess is basically where you can see the muscle fibers through the skin. So the skin is so thin that you can start to see the muscle fibers. Striations are, when you see it, it looks, like lines in the muscles where you can see the actual, fibers of the muscle themselves. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking striations or graininess. And typically where you see people, usually for women, it starts in the upper body. Shoulders tend to happen first, because as women, most of us tend to get leaner in our upper body before we get lean enough in our lower body. So that's sometimes a challenge, is making sure we're getting those shoulders full enough to where they don't start to striate when we're getting, the backside, especially lean enough to show just that little bit of separation in the tie-in. So it is an art and a science all in one. But when you start to see, a lot of separation in the quads, that's too much for bikini. You're going to see a tiny bit of separation just to get lean enough to get the backside, but you shouldn't start to see any kind of the fibers in the muscle themselves. Like that's where what we call graininess, where we can actually see the fibers moving. There's also, a lot of times vascularity comes along with that as well. Vascularity is a tough one to manage sometimes for people because it is genetic. I mean, how vascular we are has to do with, how close our veins are to our top of our skin, how big they are. Some people do tend to be more vascular than others. I was one of those that, I just tend to be more vascular. As we get older, our skin gets thinner. So it does become a little bit more difficult to have that like round, bubbly, sort of softer look as we get leaner, because that skin is just losing some of its, thickness, and different people genetically some people have thinner skin than others, So these are all things that, we have to kind of analyze and contend with and figure out how to, bring out that look in each individual athlete. Mm-hmm. So obviously we can go into a lot of the methodologies because there's a lot that goes behind that. But I think right now we're just kind of focusing in on, when the judges are looking at you, what are they looking for?
Right.
And one thing I did want to mention too is that, the judges are there to tell you what they see and what they would like to see. It's then up to you to figure out how to implement that. How do you deliver that? Yeah. Right. So for the most of the judges aren't coaches, they're not actually doing, that piece of it on a daily basis. So, you have to take, when you're asking them questions, it needs to be geared towards understanding what they're seeing and what they want to see from you. From there, it's going to be up to you and your coach or your team, of whoever you're working with, to then figure out how to deliver on that. And I think that's a really important thing to think about.
And we're going to talk more in depth about that in a second episode, where we're going to talk about interpreting judges' feedback. So, but I think those points are really spot on. And as we talk about graininess and striations, I mean, remember that there are other divisions where those qualities are a premium. I mean, men's bodybuilding, men's classic physique, women's physique, women's bodybuilding. I mean, vascularity, conditioning, and by conditioning, I mean striations and graininess. You'll hear the terms peeled in the bodybuilding sport, and that is definitely the criteria that they are looking for in those other divisions. But that's why it's also important to recognize the context of the division that you're talking about based on the criteria. So I'm glad you walked through that. All right, so we talked a little bit about the graininess and the striation aspect. So let's go into this next criteria, which is a curvy hourglass silhouette.
Right. So I think what's important in bikini to understand is, as opposed to figure or bodybuilding where they're really looking for an X frame. And by an X frame, what we're talking about is the top of the X. The points of the top of the X are going to be the shoulders. The waist is going to be where the lines cross. And then the quads, the outer sweep of the quads is going to be, the bottom. So in other divisions where they're looking for a little bit more sharpness, a little bit more extremeness to the X frame, in bikini, we're looking for more of an hourglass figure. So in other words, it's a little bit softer, still curvy, a little bit more, we're looking for a little bit more of an attainable type of physique, where we don't want things overdone in terms of the structure.
So I'm gonna ask the question that always comes to my mind whenever we talk about hourglass. So isn't the hourglass and an X the same shape?
Yes, it is definitely the same shape. I would say the difference is the sharpness and extremeness of the shape. Okay. So it's a little bit softer version. We still want to see, that there's a nice curve to the upper body, a smallness to the waist, a curve to the lower body, the glutes, the legs, things like that. So we're still looking for the shape. We're just not looking for the same level of extremeness to the actual.
So it's all the context and then the degree, which is true for every criteria that we talked about, and part of the reason why I wanted to go to the NPC standards, because the first four criteria that are spelled out there are criteria that are applied to all of the divisions. So not just bikini, but all of the female divisions for that matter. So muscularity, condition, symmetry, and balance, and presentation. So symmetry and balance is really the criteria that probably most aligns to X frame versus hourglass, or hourglass versus X frame. But it is the proportions of those things that really determine whether it's more hourglass and less X frame.
That's how I would explain it for sure. And, the way that, posing plays a huge role in this, you know what I mean? So the way that bikini should be posed is to emphasize that that hourglass shape, and in some cases that means toning down, the posing so that you're not over posing to start creating a little bit more of that X frame look. And in some people, you mentioned before, if somebody's got a very narrow shoulder width, they might need to just a slightly open up just to give them a little bit more of an hourglass shape on their particular body. So that's where, understanding your proportions in your body and how to create a little bit more balance and symmetry through posing and presentation is really, really important.
I think one thing, I don't know, let's talk about it here, and then if you want to put it off until the very end, we can. But I do think that it's interesting that the Olympia kind of sets the tone for the judging that's going to take place for the rest of the year. They set the standard for, okay, this is the athlete that we think most appropriately fits the standard or the criteria for that division. And then I find it always interesting that occasionally there will be something that people will over-index on. So, for example, the pinching of the shoulders in the back pose to narrow the top versus opening the back in the back pose to widen the top, and how that interprets based on hourglass versus X frame. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you reconcile that? How do you get that right in your mind for what the judges want in any particular year or any particular show?
Yeah, I mean, I would study the pictures. I would look at the top athletes, what they're bringing, and then also look at your own physique and, where's your strengths, where's your weaknesses. If you, have a very small and narrow upper body, and you're hitting that back pose, again, you're going to want to have the upper body balanced with the lower body. You don't want it to look small and narrow and then have these big, round, beautiful glutes and legs. So you've got to, figure out how to, first of all, build the physique that's going to be balanced to begin with, but then emphasize your strengths and weaknesses. So, if your weakness is your upper body, you might need to stand a little bit more open. Whereas if you already have, a wider shoulder girdle, you've got plenty of muscle on the upper body, but maybe the legs still need development, then in that point, you might want to pose your upper body smaller to create that balance. So it's really figuring out, understanding visually what the criteria is. And then from there, being able to compare, here's where I am, here's the things I need to work on. If I'm going to be getting on stage, we're always working on things. There's no such thing as perfection. There's always going to be things you can work on. So there's nothing wrong with getting on stage to get compared and see how you stack up, getting feedback from the judges. I will say, if you can get to some of the bigger shows and get in front of some of the national judges, that's a lot more helpful. I'm not to dog on some of the smaller regional shows, but we've had some athletes compete in some smaller regional shows recently where the feedback was
off the criteria.
Yeah, it was not in line with what I know. And again, it's the interpretation that you talked about. So finding an opportunity to, even if you're going to do a small regional to maybe get to a bigger show, I know sometimes athletes are afraid to do that. Don't be afraid. That's the whole point. If you want to be the fastest runner, run next to the, fastest people you can. It's the same way in bikini. Don't be afraid to get up there next to the top athletes because it's going to help you to see what you need to work on, which is the whole point. I mean, bodybuilding is a sport of constant growth. So definitely encourage that. But again, it's really about understanding, the hourglass frame. So if we're talking about from the back pose, we should get some nice shape and roundness through the upper body, tapering down to a small waist, and then some nice curve in the glutes and some nice shape to the legs. Nothing should be, when we look at that body, nothing should stick out. I shouldn't look at that back pose and think, oh, wow, those are some great hamstrings. You know what I mean? I should just go, wow, look how balanced and round and beautiful this physique is. There shouldn't be anything sticking out. You shouldn't, be noticing shoulders over everything, and even including glutes. Obviously, glutes are a huge part of bikini, but they shouldn't. There is such thing as being too big in the glutes. If they're overpowering, then that's an issue as well. So it's all got to be in balance.
Right. And I want to just cover 2 points down on what you're saying because I think it's so important. The first thing is, and you'll see this in Becky's IG, and I just think you should see and hear this every time, which is, we started this, is the criteria is going to apply, but it's going to look different on every body. So there are going to be many bodies that may fit the criteria. They're going to fit it differently. So the focus here is identifying the criteria for you. So if you're wider in the upper shoulder girdle, you may have to pose around that to downplay that a little bit. If you're bigger in the glutes and maybe the proportion with your legs, you may have to pose differently. We have a set progression of standard posing, but how we apply that set progression will always vary athlete to athlete, whether they, I'm thinking of the model pose and whether you push up on your hip or don't push up on your hip. And it depends on every athlete in terms of what we want to highlight, what their physique is, what their structure is, so that we are not pointing more attention to something that we want to downplay, or we want to upplay something, so we're going to highlight that a little bit more in the posing. And so posing is going to look different on everybody, even though it's the same posing. And certain aspects of that is those finer elements that we may tweak athlete to athlete. The second thing that we do have to mention here, because the criteria is always going to adjust based on who is on stage with you. So if you are wider in the shoulder shoulder girdle, and you are in a show where everybody else is very narrow in that show, your shoulders may appear even wider than they normally are because
by comparison.
By comparison. So that's another thing to factor into this. And at that pro level, being able to adjust based on what you're seeing on stage, that's a difficult thing to do, because it's you cannot see who is on stage with you. You cannot see, and likely you're not getting in those comparison rounds until I mean, most of the pro shows, they'll bring everybody out. You can get an idea, and I've seen you go and make adjustments to posing between that first individual comparison round, the individual round, and then the call outs. I
did it this weekend.
Yeah, I've seen you go back and make those adjustments when you can, based on how other people are showing up in that show. But recognize that as you're trying to get context and understanding and just kind of acceptance and embrace of the criteria, recognize that criteria is always going to modify based on who else is in the show.
And the reason I went back this last time, just as an example, is I had an athlete who her metabolism's just
so fast.
So to fill her out with enough food can be really challenging, especially without losing the waistline. When she came out and initially posed, she was pushing back too much on her glutes, which was causing some separation, deeper separation in the tie-ins and the hamstrings than I know the judges want to see. So when I saw her come out, I went back and just let her know, hey, don't push back so far. In her case, she needs to just tilt her pelvis and then not push at all. Something else that you mentioned brought up a thought too, when we're talking about everybody being a little bit different. Like a great example is if somebody's a little bit more quad dominant and they're flaring their quads in their back pose, now all of a sudden it's going to start highlighting the quads in relation to the glutes. So something so simple as whether or not you turn your toes out or turn your knees out in your back pose can immediately change things. There's another example. I'm sorry.
No,
you're fine. Go
ahead.
I
was going to say, and that can change show to show based on the specific athlete. So some shows you may want them to turn the toes out. Some shows you may want them to not turn them out based on how they're showing up for that show, what the other athletes may be. So there's some level of fluidity to that as well. Yeah. Within the show.
Yeah. There's another habit that I see a lot of people in the front pose where the bent knee, they'll lean that knee back. And if they have a little bit thinner legs, it can hollow out the inner thigh. And then they start to look a little bit too lean or a little bit too small in the leg. So there's just all these really small things that can make such a huge difference. And something I think that's really important to know is that sometimes the judges are going to say, your legs looked a little bit too small or too lean or something to that effect. And, they're taking in your whole thing. They might not be honing in on the very specific thing of like, I just need to tilt my knee this way, or I just need to, so that's where, again, that interpretation. And I think that's why it's, what we're talking about is important is, first of all, getting the feedback, but then understanding how to interpret it. And then also understanding how to apply it and implement it in a way that's going to help overcome whatever those, holes are in the physique or in the presentation. Sometimes it's, the judges might, feel like you're too small in a certain area and you're just posing it too small, so it really is important to understand, and even ask, additional questions. Do I need more development? Is it a posing issue? Like what's going on that's keeping me from, presenting the physique to the best of my ability.
And you had mentioned something in the prior discussion about losing your waistline, and I wanted to, with an athlete with a very fast metabolism that we're trying to fill out, I did want to just go back and explain a little bit about what we mean by that, so that everybody's clear on that. When you are on show day and we are keeping food very light because we do not want the waist to expand or look like it's expanding because there's too much food in the belly, and we'll see this from especially we will see this in the NPC or amateur ranks from time to time, is between prejudging and finals, there will be somebody who will go out and eat a lot, and you'll see literally a little food baby down in that ultra lean physique because they're just putting more food in than their body can handle at that time. So on show day, we purposely keep food really low. We want to really focus on carbs and some fats, carbs to pump that glycogen in the muscle to fill the muscle, fats to slow down the absorption somewhat. So because food is going to be light. But when we say don't lose the waist, if we have an athlete that has a really fast metabolism, especially on show day, you can't feed them what you would feed them the day before or the week of, because it's show day and that food's going to show. So that's what we mean by losing the waist. And I just want, and go ahead, you can explain.
Well, I was going to say, to
further.
be clear, like we don't keep food really low necessarily. I mean, it depends on the athlete.
True, that's fair.
And in some cases, I am feeding people quite a bit on show day. I wanted to just clarify, it's food volume.
Thank you.
That we want to keep low. So we will go with less voluminous types of foods to be able to fill out on show day. Usually I won't use as much protein on show day. I'll pull out, more fibrous types of food because we want fiber. Fiber is really important and really good. But on show day specifically, where we want to keep that core so nice and tight, we don't want to fill the colon with a bunch of, food that is unnecessary. So usually we're going to go with really simple carbs, and then fats that are not too bulky, that are going to be able to fill out the muscle. So usually we'll go a little bit more towards the fats. If we're getting a little bit too hard looking and we want to soften that look a little bit, we'll go a little bit more to the carbs if we feel like we want to pull a little bit more of that water into the muscle and create a little bit more fullness and a little bit drier look.
I don't know if everybody paid attention to what just happened, but this is a great illustration of why words matter and how they are interpreted differently. So I use the words "keep food light," and Jami explained the deeper understanding of that, which is to keep volume of food light. And so I don't think, I'd love to tell you that was planned. It was not planned, but it does illustrate the importance of, hey, words matter and the interpretation of those words matter and the application forward of those words matters. So that's just a little microcosm of what we're talking about relative to the bikini standard and applying those words.
Well, and I want to illustrate that in one of the ways I see a lot when people get feedback, the judge might say, I want to see your glutes fuller. And then,
well, now you're cutting into our second episode, but it's okay. Go ahead.
And then, how you interpret that. Does that mean I need more muscle? Does that mean I needed to eat a little bit more? Does that mean maybe I wasn't lean enough and I need actually to get a little more separation and then fill out to give the illusion of size? So there's just a lot of nuances and a lot of small details to understand. And this is where I really encourage asking questions, which is how we have learned so much, is we're constantly picking, the judges' brains so that we can better interpret where they're coming from, because, we're together all the time and we just used, we were explaining the same thing, but using different words and then, that kind of thing. So, it's the same, when you're talking to different judges, they may use words interchangeably or describe things a little bit different. I would always look for, and what I do look for is what's the common thread,
right?
What am I hearing most consistently? What am I seeing? How are things comparing visually when I'm looking at it? So I do think that there's, a lot of aspects to take into account when you're interpreting, what the criteria means, what it means for you, what it means when you're looking at it in other athletes, and so you've got to be a student of the sport.
And we started out this discussion by I explained a little bit about my background of being a trial lawyer, and rest assured that before we went into any trial, we were researching the judge. We were researching how many times did they rule for plaintiff versus defendant, who are other people who've tried cases in front of this judge, how does this judge interpret the law, how do they interpret the code, the evidence code, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a lot of research that went into every judge before we went into a trial. And that's no different than what we're describing here, is that it's research to get a better understanding of how the judges are going to apply that criteria, and also recognize one of the factors that judging panels will vary, whether it's one person, two person, three people, five people, the whole different judging panel. That judging panel, the dynamic of that individual judging panel is going to yield different results, or different interpretations of the criteria based on the makeup of that panel. It's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just the way things are. So we like to get that perspective across a wide landscape of the judges so that we have a better understanding of how both the individual judges are applying the criteria, but also how the panels are applying that criteria.
And I think we had one
Yeah, there's
thing
one
that,
other oh, go ahead.
there was one point left. Was that the boxy glutes?
Overall presentation. No, we did not talk about. We talked about full round glutes with slight separation between the hams and glutes. You did not talk about squared off glutes.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk. I wanted to circle back because I thought I missed that. So basically, what they're saying is that it should be a nice round glute shape. You don't want to see that outer glute kind of squaring off. Usually when I see that happening, it's a posing issue. Usually, if we are, experiment a little bit with, toes in, toes out, knees in, knees out, we can find where that glute looks the most round. They want to see a nice upper and outer glute roundness and shape overall, but they don't want to see to the point where it starts to look a little bit boxy. So some of that can be training, but a lot of times I feel like, I've been able to correct that just through adjustments to the posing.
That squared off glute aspect is such a fine line distinction. And I do think you're right that mostly it can be resolved in posing, which that's the last point here, which is an overall presentation that exudes health and femininity.
Right. And, a big part of this is confidence. I mean, truly, I've seen it where, if there's two physiques and they're pretty close and one person just goes out and shines and is having fun and is confident and looks like they really believe in themselves, I mean, they sell it. And that person's going to most likely win it. So, I mean, sometimes you get, especially as you're coming up in the lower levels, like you might get away with, maybe not the best posing, the best presentation, but as you continue to, evolve in the sport and go up in the, at the different levels, it's going to become more and more important. And then of course, at the pro level, it's so important. It's huge because every single physique is so incredible on the stage that, being able to know your angles, to be able to know how to present yourself and to, exude that confidence. Little things like making sure that you're looking up. Sometimes you'll have people that are nervous and they're looking down a lot. Or, they're wiggling around a lot to see, like, it looks like they don't really know where the pose is and they're looking, they're trying to feel for it. Usually I find that happens with people that are practicing in front of the mirror too much and not practicing without the mirror. And so they're not really sure what their pose feels like. And you can see that, so, if you're up there and you're on stage and you're questioning whether or not you're doing it right, then the judges are going to pick up on that, and usually, it just looks like it can look like a person's bored or it can look like they're mad, but in reality, they're just in their head questioning themselves and whether or not they're doing it right. So the key is to have this practiced so well that it's muscle memory. And then you're, more focused on, smiling and conveying, energy and that kind of thing.
And we say, I don't even know how many times we said this past weekend, but we say it a lot every weekend, which is how you practice will determine how you present. So I know a lot of people think that, I'm just practicing, and small details like, are you practicing in front of a mirror? If you're practicing in front of a mirror is great, but you're not going to have a mirror on stage. So being able to practice without the mirror and really feel into the poses, a lot of people will not smile and they will not think of the energy that they're wanting to present in that practice session. Well, and I hear this all the time. Well, I'll turn it on show day. Okay, I get that, and you probably will. But on show day, there's going to be a whole host of other things going on in your mind. So how you practice is really going to determine how you present. And as we say, practice leads to progress, and practice will ultimately translate into how you present. That energy capture is so important. And if you are not thinking that you're confident, if you are not confident in your posing, that's what the judges will see, is that lack of confidence. And I do think, this last thing that I'll say is it emphasizes health and femininity. No word in there says sexiness. Okay, so sexiness is not a standard. And I particularly, this is just my own personal opinion, my own personal feeling of this, is that I want to see an athlete on stage. I want to see a physique on stage. This is about presenting that physique and that athlete in the best possible light. I'll give you an art analogy. You're not going to put a crazy gold inlay, magnificent frame around the Mona Lisa. You're going to put a frame that really emphasizes the art. That's what the frame is there to do. The frame is not meant to be the art. The art is meant to be the art. So let's frame this in a way that really says that you're an athlete, that you are fierce, that you're a competitor. Those are the femininity and the health aspects are paramount in my mind. So what I would tell people listening to this, again, this is my perspective, tone down the sexiness stuff and really inflate, showcase, feature the athlete part of your physique. Focus on that when you're posing. When you're thinking in your mind, well, I want to be sexy, that's not what the judges want. The judges want femininity and health and power and athlete. That's what they want. So channel those qualities.
I'm glad that you brought that up. A couple of things just to kind of elaborate on what you're saying. I know we had an issue for a while where a lot of the girls were, touching themselves and that kind of thing. And I think, people have started to get away from it, which is great. But that was one of those things that started to become overly sexualized, and that's not what this is about. So, even just the little caresses on the legs or the glutes or, even, the shoulder, whatever it is, like we don't need any of those kinds of things. The other thing too, that I know is not on that list, but the fit and cut of the suit is really important. This is also going to help, illustrate the other things we talked about in terms of the structure and the frame and things like that. So you want that to fit right, but you also don't want it to be too small on the top or so low on the bottoms, or too narrow in the back on the bottoms. Like we don't want to see, private parts. We need those all covered. And,
there's a difference between the suit showcasing your physique and then the suit becoming the showcase, which is not what you want. And if the suit's too small, that's what it becomes.
Right. And then this is, again, it's kind of like over sexualizing the sport. So, just make sure that fits correctly, that, you're checking it before you go out too and things like that. And, make sure that, there's enough fabric to cover everything. Right. I mean, it's, I think, it's fine to have, the glutes are going to be exposed for the most part because we're judging. That's muscle. That's that certain part. But, we want to make sure that everything else is covered appropriately. And covering down on you, by the way, it on the NPC website, it does say overall look, hair, makeup, suit, and tan. And definitely, I mean, we saw this, one of our athletes a few weeks ago had a sunburn, and the tan would not hold, and so the tan just was not looking as good as we have seen it look on this athlete, and it hurt the scoring. It hurt the scoring of that athlete, in particular because one of the lines from the skin that was peeling from the sunburn was right down the glute, and so that's where the pigmentation of the tan was just not holding very well. Right. So all those things matter, and it's our responsibility as athletes, as coaches, to help figure out how to best present all of those things, whether, there are different types of tanning products. So figuring out which one works best on your body, making sure that you're doing the skin prep ahead of time. Right. And I mean, just all the details to be able to really bring that beautiful athletic feminine sort of look to stage that's just visually appealing is really, really important.
And so when you're asking about whether jewelry matters, whether suit matters, whether tan matters, yes, is the answer. It all matters because it's all part of your presentation. It's all part of the art that you are presenting on stage. So if you're wondering, does my hair matter? Yes, it does. And hairstyle, I mean, we spend a lot of time, curl, no curl, body, less body. We're looking at that, but we're not looking at that in terms of, hey, there's one size fits all. We're looking at it based on, okay, for this particular athlete, what is going to showcase their art the best.
Right. And what are they going to feel the most beautiful in? So there's that combination of the two. So if we're looking at an athlete and, we really like a certain suit color, or we really like hair a certain way, but they don't feel good in it, they're going to go out, they're not going to present as well. So there's a balance between making sure that you feel authentically yourself and that you're going to feel beautiful and present well. And then also that you're, doing something. If you're a really small athlete, maybe too big a hair might be overpowering and throw off your look. So, there's a combination of those two things that you want to bring together. I'm so happy you said that, because the hair thing really becomes a factor, especially on that back pose, where if the hair is covering too much and you're a narrower shoulder girl, you can't see the shoulders. And we've actually gotten that feedback where the hair was covering the shoulders, and then when we're talking with the judges afterwards, you move the hair and show the shoulders, like, oh, well, that's fine. You don't need more shoulders. Like,
It was just
But
the
they
hair.
can't judge what they can't see.
That's right. And so that to me really crystallized the importance of how everything matters, but everything does not matter in a vacuum, meaning everything matters as it relates to the other things, all of which that matters. So you've got to put together the full package to make sure you're presenting the best physique, which is the goal of the sport.
Yeah. So hopefully this has been helpful.
I learned something.
What'd you learn?
I think I got even more crystal clear on the fact that little details really matter a lot. And I'm not saying I didn't realize that before, but gosh, as we talk about that, and as I'm thinking about this weekend, I'm just thinking how just those little shifts, a 5-degree shift in the shoulder angle, a 10% less hair, how all those things can make such a big difference in the ultimate presentation of that physique. And as we've talked about all the time, control what you can control. You can't control the other athletes, but what you can control is yourself and how you present your best physique. And so as we were looking at those, the criteria, the one thing that I really wanted to highlight is, I'm going to read this directly. The requirements above look different on everyone. And then there's another thing here. So how do you translate this to your physique? Follow the guidelines listed above. Nothing more, nothing less. Don't overcomplicate things. Bring your best self to the stage and don't try to imitate anyone else. We want to see the bikini standards on your unique physique. Focus on that alone. So maybe that's a good mic drop for us to talk about.
I love that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's remember the 3 B's then as we sign off. Be good to yourself.
Be good to each other.
And be safe. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to FitBody Lifestyle. We hope today's episode has left you feeling motivated and equipped to tackle your fitness goals, business challenges, and the daily dance of life. Remember to value progress over perfection. Life's tough enough alone. Find the chosen family around you to help you along the way.
If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe and leave us a review on your favorite streaming platform. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at FitBodyFusion.